Hey, this is Mike Johnston. Thanks a lot. Welcome to the podcast. And today I want to talk about COVID-19. COVID-19 in particular in relation to HIV. And this is something that's been kind of poo-pooed a little bit by mainstream media and by the scientific community, but at the same time, it just kind of stayed at the back of my mind, especially when a French researcher who was actually one of the three people who shared the Nobel Prize for discovering the HIV virus said specifically that COVID-19 was not a natural virus. It was manufactured and it contained parts of the HIV virus, and it would have been impossible to evolve naturally. Okay, well that's, them's fighting words there, right? I mean, when you're going to say something like that, and China's going to be upset, and certainly the scientific community was upset. Here, let me go to a screenshot, and we will go over a little bit, because this is kind of the setup for what got me into doing the research, which led to me doing the video. So I want to just set it up kind of from the beginning as I did it and take you along on the journey that I went on, and we'll both get to the same place and see what you think. I am not a scientist. I am someone who I think can understand scientific literature for the most part. So, and hopefully I can show you what it says and link a few things together, which may or may not prove to be accurate, but it at least looks good on paper. And so you got to excuse me how I look. I just got back from my bike ride, and it was raining, and I'm totally like moist there. I used the word moist, but anyway, so let's look at the website that has Snopes. Actually, we'll look at Snopes, and it has a story about the French researcher. So here, let's switch over to that window. Okay. Snopes says, did this Nobel Prize winner say COVID-19 was created in a lab? And they say, yes, indeed, he did say that. 2008 Nobel Prize winner Luc Montagnier said that COVID-19 coronavirus disease was artificially created in a lab by biologists working on an AIDS vaccine. That's really specific. It sounds like almost he knew exactly what he was talking about, doesn't it? So they say, yeah, he did say that, and he's got the credentials to back up what he said, certainly. And I'll put a link to all of the stories and papers that I reference in the description of the video / podcast, and you can do your own research. I'm not asking you to believe anything that I say, but this is valid research and it's real stuff, so it's probably worth having a look at, right? And of course, once someone said that COVID-19 might not be a natural virus, then everybody had to jump on the bandwagon from their own perspective. Now, here is other French scientists, because why not be criticized by your peers, claiming that French experts have refuted the claim by their colleague and Nobel Prize-winning scientist Luc Montagnier that the novel coronavirus caused by the COVID-19 pandemic has been engineered and contains some genes of HIV-1. Montagnier last week told the French news channel there was manipulation around the virus, the coronavirus of the bat. Someone added sequences, in particular of HIV, the virus of AIDS. It is not natural. It is the work of professionals, of molecular biologists. A very meticulous work. And you would think the guy would know that. He identified HIV to start with. He shared a Nobel Prize for that. I have no idea what he's done after that. But apparently not everybody agrees with him. I'm sure the Chinese don't agree, because that wouldn't look good on them if it was a manufactured virus. Even if, as this researcher says, he believes that whoever designed it was trying to create a vaccine for HIV. Be that as it may, the scientists in France who opposed his opinion said the hypothesis that a virus was created in a laboratory in Wuhan sounded a conspiracy vision that does not relate to the real science, said Jean-Francois Delfraise. I'm terrible with French. Oh well. An immunologist and head of the scientific council that advises the French government on the COVID-19 pandemic. Everyone in the scientific community agrees that COVID-19 is a coronavirus. From time to time, there are coronaviruses different from the others, as are SARS and MERS, with a pathogenicity which has appeared. Okay, and those two viruses I will revisit soon, but before I do, I want to look at another article. Not long after these articles came out, there was another one, and this one is like if you just do a Google search for COVID-19 or similarities between COVID-19 and HIV, this article will come up. And basically, the writer in the European Scientist takes the time to debunk the idea that there is any part of HIV, any meaningful part of HIV, of the HIV virus in the COVID-19 virus. So let's have a look at this article now, and we will attempt to see where this guy goes with it. Hang on, and boom, we're back. Okay. So in the European Scientist, which is, a fairly good, well-reputed publication, the artist Philippe Lecunde says, no, SARS-CoV-2 does not contain HIV genetic code. And he goes through, his background, the hypothesis. Let's start with the hypothesis that some nucleotide sequences of HIV-1 can be found in the complete genome of SARS-CoV-2. And so he looks at the genome and he does a search on BLAST. And here's where I got interested, because it's like, okay, here's a tool I can use and I can check out what he's doing. I can run my own tests on this tool to see if I can find anything else. So this is cool. So he ran, as you see right here, a test which is basically, he compared one virus, this one, which is COVID-19, severe acute respiratory syndrome, COVID-19 isolate Wuhan. And he found no significant similarity with HIV. Okay. Now, I when I first read this, I didn't really, understand BLAST because I'd never used it or anything. But as I began to use it, I realized that was kind of disingenuous, though accurate. Yes, you can compare COVID-19 to just about anything, and it won't come up with any 98, 99% matches other than other versions of COVID-19. Okay, so it's fairly unique. I mean, the closest relative, if you want to say it that way, that I could find was a bat coronavirus, which had about an 87% matchup between their two complete genomes. So, yeah, it does look like COVID-19 did come from a bat coronavirus. Now, could someone in a lab with sufficient education and skill take the bat coronavirus and splice pieces into it? Yeah, seems like they could. So that doesn't answer the question of is it or is it not something that was manipulated in the lab. That's just, beyond the scope of what I'm trying to do and what I can answer. What I'm trying to do is just find out how it's related to HIV, if at all, and if it is, what that relationship could present itself as in patients. Okay, because that's important. So let's have a look at this story again, though, by the European Scientist writer. Okay. And then he says, are there vague similarities? Now, there are sequences of HIV-1 that would be vaguely similar to some other sequences of SARS-CoV-2. If we change the criteria, you go from direct match criteria to vague match criteria. Is there some part of the genome which is a match? Okay, so instead of saying the entire genome, which controls every little aspect of the virus, you say, is there just part of it that matches? So, like if that was the human genome, you could say, okay, are humans and gorillas exactly alike? No. Or humans and chimps? No, we're not. We're not a direct, but we are like a 97% match. So, most of the genome of a chimpanzee, because I'm not sure about a gorilla, the percentage, but a chimpanzee is like 97. I'm sure a gorilla is close. Anyway, is very similar. And so, there are then like 3% of vague similarities, which comprise all the differences in the two species. So even a small piece of genetic material, which is the same, might be very important in the overall organism. It might specify or define some specific part. And that's where I think this author is really like deficient in how he explains things, because he makes vague similarities seem to be that they don't really mean that much. The answer is obviously yes, and I'm continuing with what he has written here. The answer is obviously yes, as both viruses have a glycoprotein envelope, even though if they belong to two completely different families, HIV is a lentivirus while SARS is a coronavirus, the two viruses are bound to have something in common. In fact, we can prove this using BLAST. Yes, very good. Okay, and then I went on to check his work, and I did prove that myself using BLAST. But according to him, and he actually, says, yeah, as we see, yes, the part of the HIV-1 genome and the part of the SARS-CoV-2 genome that encode the two different glycoprotein envelopes are 90% similar. So the two glycoprotein envelopes are 90% similar. That's very similar to each other. And remember that, because now the next thing we have to do is figure out what a glycoprotein envelope is and what it does in HIV, which is something that he doesn't even go into here, because now he diverts into the common cold, blah, 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 and other things, and we don't need to worry about that for the purposes of what we're doing here. Oh, and before I divert on to the next part of what I want to talk about, this paper right here is a paper you'll see referenced in the literature and in other papers about the relationship between COVID-19 and HIV. This is a paper that was written early on in India and submitted, and then I read that it was later retracted, although it's still available online, so I'll put the link down in the description below, and the link will be called slide 5. I just decided to name each link as a slide for whatever reason. It makes no sense, but that's something it's not as important, because according to stuff I read, it was withdrawn later. But that sets the stage for what I'd like to next, and what I'd like to look at next is just the BLAST tool itself and the results after I ran some things like and some interesting things I found too, which will help set the stage for the next segment of what I want to talk about with HIV and COVID-19. So let's see here. I ran, let's see, I'll go back to looking at the screen here. Okay, let's start over here. So here's just all the genomes that I looked at. This is the COVID-19 genome. This is SARS, the original SARS. This is HIV. This is Roussette's bat coronavirus. Ebola, which doesn't really factor into it because it has nothing in common with Ebola, even, that I could find. So Ebola, I ran it just for the heck of it, but there's really nothing there. And there's the flu. Okay, so here's the BLAST tool, which I will leave a link to in the description. It'll probably be slide 6. And for this, we ran the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, which is COVID-19, against HIV. Okay, and you see and these are just here. We'll look at this. This is small. The entire genome is really big, but this is just small. This controls a specific part of the thing that's which is the thing that's common between HIV and COVID-19, which is the glycoprotein envelope. So you see here it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 matches with the glycoprotein envelope in various forms of HIV. There's HIV isolate XJ16, HIV clone, HIV isolate from the USA, HIV isolate from Spain, and Zimbabwe. So this is an exact match or close to exact match. The percent identical is about 86% most of the time, except for this one, the one from the USA, where it's 93.33% of a match. And so the glycoproteins in HIV and COVID-19 seem as though they match. So that's why it's going to be important to understand what glycoprotein envelopes do for HIV and see if COVID-19 mimics that ability. Okay. So then here we'll just look at a couple more. This is MERS, and this is because I was just digging and doing research. Previous coronaviruses that have caused a lot of problems, as that article before mentioned, MERS was one of them, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. So, and I compared it, see up here I compared HIV up here. I started with HIV and compared it to MERS. And what do you know? 71% identical to a genomic sequence. It doesn't say which one though. But so now we know both COVID-19 and MERS had pieces of HIV in them. That doesn't mean somebody put them there. Certainly they could have evolved those proteins themselves. Okay, so I'm not saying somebody created it because there's no way I can see that with what I'm doing. But I'm saying they have these in common, which is important to know. It's not like COVID-19 is the only virus ever to have a piece of HIV code in it. Okay, so the next one then is, okay, this is SARS-1. This is HIV against the bat coronavirus. I'm sorry. So, and indeed, there are instances where HIV sequences are included in the bat coronavirus. So there now we have, if we can say that, and it looks like the bat coronavirus was the basis of the evolution of COVID-19 or the creation of COVID-19, however you want to say it. And the bat coronavirus too has instances where HIV parts are included. And as you see, where the HIV is included in the bat coronavirus is the glycoprotein spike. Okay, and that's very important because that's where it is in our version of COVID-19. And it's a 94.74% identical copy of the glycoprotein spike. And glycoprotein gene. Okay, so that could be the envelope. It could be just the spikes on the envelope, which we will see in a moment here how that is used. And then here we have the original SARS. Okay, this is the original SARS compared to HIV, and what do you know? It has an HIV sequence in it, and this is from USA, and it looks like a different sequence though, the provirus genomic sequence, and it's an 87.88% match. So it is not uncommon apparently for coronaviruses, especially the really severe pandemic level coronaviruses, to have portions of HIV in them. Okay, so that is good that we understand that. Before I jump right to the glycoprotein definition, though, let me show you quickly what both the HIV virus and COVID-19 virus actually look like, because it's important to see this. Now, see, this is the HIV virus, and these little stalks here are going to factor in when we learn about the glycoprotein envelope. And here is the COVID-19 virus, and as you see, it has these same little structures here. So this is important because if we go to the glycoprotein envelope right here, which will also be the next slide, which should be slide 6. This explains how the glycoprotein envelope helps the HIV virus break into T cells. And T cells are the important thing for HIV because they are your immune system cells. So once it can break into them and replicate inside them and kill them, it wears your body down. And the more copies of itself that it can get your immune system to build and release, the more of your immune system is infected until your immune system basically breaks down and you can be killed by just about any infection that you get, which is how HIV kills people. It's not actually HIV that kills you, it's something else. And, interestingly, your immune system doesn't actually kill the virus when it's defending itself. It kills the cells that are infected with the virus. Kind of an interesting thing to think about. So, and like I said, if you want to read this whole story, it's not super long, but it's a little bit involved, the process that it uses. And it's interesting to know, so I encourage you to go read it. And because the glycoprotein envelope is exactly what HIV uses to break into T cells. Now, this made me think, well, if this is true, and there is a relationship, caused by that common glycoprotein envelope between COVID-19 and HIV, then the way to know that, because most viruses can't break into your immune cells, okay, your T cells. That's something that HIV is a specialist at. Most viruses can't do that. So if COVID-19 can break into T cells, then we can see how it's using that little piece of HIV genome that it apparently does have. Now, again, I'm not saying that makes it a manufactured, genetically manipulated organism. It could be perfectly natural, but it's important to understand how it works, because so many people don't seem to understand why the government did the lockdown that it did for as long as it did, why they want to do contact tracing into the foreseeable future. Because if you beat the disease, you're immune, what's the point, right? And I saw an article today, which I don't have a link to yet, that said if you had COVID-19 and you recovered, you're not going to be allowed to join the military. That's interesting. Why would that be? Well, perhaps like HIV, COVID-19 may never go away. You may always have it till you and be able to communicate it until you die. And if that's the case, then COVID-19 is actually like the nightmare version of HIV to some extent, except mostly it's a totally different virus, but it may or may not have that aspect of it in common because it has that glycoprotein envelope. So next I decided to do some research to see if we know yet whether the COVID-19 virus can infect human T cells, and if so, what it does. One thing I found before I continue is just that there's a lot of people out there that essentially don't want to believe what you show them if it doesn't jive with what they already believe, which is kind of weird, I think. But that said, let's jump in here and look at how COVID-19 and HIV affect your immune system and whether COVID-19 can, in fact, attack your T cells. And if you look at the link, the slide 7 link below, that is just a link to an article that explains how HIV attacks your system. If you want that background, there's an article that can allow you to research that. Okay, so here we have an article from the Thailand Medical News. Thailand Medical News, I believe, from what I've read, and I read just like a small blurb on it, but it seems to be the publication of Thailand's national health system, which seems like it would be a fairly credible source. And plus, I usually, when I look at published news sources and use them to build a narrative, I always try to make sure that they have researched what they're saying and they provide links to their information sources, and Thailand Medical News seems to do that. So, the title is COVID-19 Alert. New study shows SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus targets and destroys T cells similarly as what HIV does. Similar to what HIV does. I'm sorry, I'm correcting, but it's, it's translated, so what do you expect? Translations are not always great. Okay, boom, there you have it. So, yes, COVID-19 does attack T cells, but there are some differences because COVID-19 is not HIV. Let's just look at this a little bit here. Okay, the study has been published in the Journal of... Okay, well, what does it do? We'll look at the synopsis. To add to many studies already showing that the deadly and potent ways the SARS-CoV-2 has of attacking various human host cells and also critical proteins and cellular pathways in the human cells, a new collaborative study by researchers from the United States and China now shows that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus also attacks the T lymphocytes similarly in the way that HIV viruses act. And again, we know already from a moment ago that the glycoprotein envelope is the common feature that HIV and COVID-19 have, and that the glycoprotein envelope is the thing that allows HIV to break into T cells. So this seems like it would be the next logical step to take if you are postulating what COVID-19 might do. That doesn't mean it would necessarily be true, just that it would be the next logical step to take. And the study that claims that has been published in the Journal of Cellular and Molecular Immunology, which is part of the credible Nature journals, and you can't get a whole lot more credible than Nature. Okay. And has already been peer-reviewed and is endorsed by many medical experts. So this link will be slide number 8 below. And let's just jump over so you can have a look at it. I'm not going to read a lot from the science articles because, it might be overkill for this particular application. How I'll just read what the authors have said about it, provide you with the links so you can go and do as much research as you want. Now, actually, the Thailand Medical News story will be slide 8, and then the Nature article will be slide 9. Okay. So SARS-CoV-2 infects T lymphocytes through its spike protein-mediated membrane fusion. And remember, the spike protein is part of the glycoprotein envelope. So, it's a relatively long paper. I'll just jump to what the story says about it. The human immune system has many components that work together in protecting the body from foreign invaders. One of the most important types of immune cells is the T lymphocytes, or T cells. A type of, and if I mispronounce anything in here, I apologize. I'm doing my best. Okay. A type of white blood cell that acts as the core of adaptive immunity, the system that modifies the immune response to specific pathogens. Researchers from the New York Blood Center and also from Fudan University in Shanghai have discovered that the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus, which is COVID-19, and often results in severe acute respiratory syndrome, also attacks the immune system's T lymphocytes. The worrying findings highlight the destructive power of the novel coronavirus, which can destroy the immune system, leaving the patient vulnerable and unable to fight off the infection. There, now, with that sentence, maybe if the governments who were initiating and perpetuating the lockdowns would tell you that, it might make it easier to understand why they're doing what they're doing and maybe get people to be more receptive to cooperating with these things. Okay, but now I've also found there is a difference in what coronavirus does once it breaks into a T cell compared to what HIV does. So that's coming up here shortly. But that's the main thing. Now, what the initial symptoms of a COVID-19 infection, which everybody talks about, is the flu-like symptoms. The fever, the runny nose, the cough, and then that progresses from there. But interestingly enough, and a lot of people don't know this, in fact, I didn't until I did some research, is that HIV, on its initial infection, usually within 2 to 14 days of infection, will provide very similar symptoms with some differences, like there's more, with diarrhea and things as a symptom with HIV than there is with the initial symptoms of COVID-19. But in general, if you look at them side to side, you would say, oh, okay, these are similar sets of symptoms. And, I never really even knew there was an initial set of symptoms that was like the flu that went away with HIV. Who knows that unless you've taken the time to do a little research on HIV. Okay. Now let me switch back over to the web here because I just want to read a little bit more of this story so you can see one of the things that it brings out. Okay, the team arrived at their research findings by capturing cells infected with the virus that had penetrated their membrane and injected toxic chemicals into the cells. It was observed that the chemicals killed both the virus and the infected cells by disintegrating them. Okay. However, surprisingly, the researchers found that when the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus and the T cell came into contact with each other, the T cell became prey of the coronavirus, wherein a structure in the spike of the coronavirus triggered the attachment of a viral envelope to the cell membrane of the T cells. After, the genes of the virus entered the T cell and overwhelmed it and took it hostage, the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus deactivated its ability to protect the human host body. Now, here is where we can understand the differences between the two. And I think that sentence is important because HIV, from what I have read, I am certainly not an expert, but from what I've read, HIV enters the T cells and replicates within them, which is what they usually do in any cell, any virus. It's how they reproduce. They inject their RNA into a cell, and then it forces the cell to build copies of the virus, and then eventually the cell swells up and explodes, and all the little viruses are released to go infect other cells. But from what I've read with the COVID-19 virus, yes, it can attach to the T cells, it can break into the T cell and inject its RNA in there, but then it doesn't replicate. It can't force the cell to replicate. And so if that was all that happened, it would be all well and good and no damage done, right? Okay. But it seems like, from what several different papers have said and in several different areas, that what may happen is that it actually creates a zombie cell. Okay? It deactivates the T cell from its main function of protecting the body, but doesn't kill it. It doesn't replicate, it doesn't explode the cell, it doesn't kill it, it just deactivates it. And that could be really weird, right, for your body, because your body would look at it and be like, oh, okay, my immune system's fine, all the T cells are there, they're all good, they're alive, but they're zombies. They can't do anything. So that when another infection happens, or perhaps even when COVID-19 infects other cells in which it can reproduce, your body's like, oh, well, send the white blood cells, and they all dash over there, the T cells, and they don't do anything, or they don't even dash over. I don't know. They just bump up against the other, and they're like, they're brain dead, essentially. I don't know if that's been 100% proven yet, but, it's been said, by researchers in apparently published peer-reviewed papers, so it does seem credible, and it, seems like something that would be pretty dangerous. Maybe even more dangerous than what HIV does in one sense, at least, because, and that it ties into also what we'll talk about in a few minutes with a cytokine storm that is already been seen in especially children and other people, and how that happens. Okay, let's look back at this again. Okay, additional research also showed that patients who died from COVID-19 had damage to their bodies similar to both SARS and HIV. Okay, well there's, from the end of it, and also HIV is coming in there. But, again, remember, I'm not saying that COVID-19 is HIV. I'm just saying that now we've seen that they both can break into the same cells, which is probably bad, and even though they may present themselves within the cell, the T cells, differently, maybe the end result isn't that different in that they prevent the T cells from doing what they're supposed to do, by two different methods. But if that's the case, it's still very serious and something that has to be dealt with, definitely. And it could, go on forever until they find a vaccine or an antidote. But it's been 40 years and we still don't have a vaccine against HIV. And since COVID-19 can be spread so much more easily than HIV, obviously it's much more dangerous from that perspective. Okay, so we have that much established, that it seems that indeed COVID-19 can detrimentally affect the immune system, whereas most things can't. But remember, the original SARS, right, or no, the bat coronavirus and the MERS virus we saw already did contain parts of HIV. So that doesn't mean it's a manufactured thing. It just means that these are things that it can do. The next aspect I would like to look at concerns the ability of COVID-19 to turn off the functions of another cell, in this case red blood cells. I remember when I saw a doctor in New York make a YouTube video where he first espoused this idea, at least that was the first I had seen it, and he said patients he was seeing with COVID-19 were not responding to being on a ventilator because it was as though they had high altitude sickness. Like, even though the ventilator is putting oxygen into their lungs just aren't picking it up for whatever reason. And he postulated, or he might have read this Chinese study that is referenced in the story I'm going to show you, but what he was postulating was that COVID-19 was attacking the red blood cells and turning off their ability to carry oxygen. So just like we saw with the T cells, where they were turning off, or theorized to be turning off the ability of T cells to function, the same thing in this case was being done with red blood cells. And there's a little timeline to this story, so I'll start at the beginning of it and then I'll run through a couple of pieces to get to where we are now with it, at least as far as I know where we are now with it. So this is, again, in Thailand Medical News. Must read, research reveals that COVID-19 attacks hemoglobin in red blood cells, rendering it incapable of transporting oxygen. Current medical protocols could all be wrong. And of course, this was like from over a month ago, from April 9th. Okay, and basically here is a link to the paper from the Chinese researchers who had postulated this. And it says that the virus is able to attack the ACE2 receptors in the lung tissues and cause damage, and also while cytokine storms, and we're going to learn more about cytokine storms later, are creating more damage, it is most probably the body's inability to get enough oxygen along with carbon dioxide buildup that is creating the so-called ARDS symptoms and stress, and current protocols could be all wrong, including the usage of ventilators in a non-proper manner that could actually aggravate already injured and inflamed lungs. Red blood cells are a critical oxygen carrier to the various cells in the body. Inside the red blood cells is a molecule called hemoglobin that contains hemigroups. Each of these hemigroups is a molecular ring, porphyrin, that holds an iron ion, or Fe, which is iron, remember the chemical table, Fe. It is the Fe ions that help transport oxygen in the bloodstream depending on states of oxidation. Once inside a human host cell, the COVID-19 virus's RNA also codes for a number of non-structural proteins that are created during the replication process. These proteins are not part of the virus itself, but helps the virus to hijack other cellular pathways or actions to facilitate its survival in the host. And here is the YouTube video with the doctor theorizing all this, and I will include that in the links below, the link to the video. The research discovered that some of these proteins are to hijack the red blood cells and remove the iron ions from the hemigroups and replace themselves with it. This makes the hemoglobin unable to transport oxygen, so that the patient would then basically suffocate to death without even realizing it, because they have no labored breathing, their lungs aren't filled with fluid, everything seems to be basically okay, and yet they die. So that's pretty horrible. However, since this has been published, there have been doctors and scientists and doctor scientists who have been refuting this, and there is actually an alternative explanation for the evidence at hand, because the fact that people are apparently dying in this manner is not really disputed. It's just the manner in which they are killed. I should also note, as a lead-in to the next part of this story, if you scroll down in the Thailand medical news story, you'll see an update from the 14th of April on a non-peer-reviewed preprint by a British medical professional who has in the past been funded by the Wellcome Trusts that is backed by a huge pharmaceutical interest, is currently challenging the study of the Chinese researchers. And we will include a link to this story too. And here's a link to another new interesting study which is not related, which they just decided to throw in there, which I'll also check that out in a second. So here is the rebuttal paper. It's titled "Flawed Methods in COVID-19 Attacks the 1-Beta Chain of Hemoglobin and Captures the Porphyrin to Inhibit Human Hememetabolism." And then I will include a link to this. And then also I found another article on Medium.com from an MD and a PhD, so he has several degrees, and he also debunks that concept. Now, what's interesting is that, yeah, that may be the wrong interpretation of what is going on, but it still doesn't take away the fact that it's happening. You know, people are apparently dying from lack of oxygen, and it can't quite be explained by the fact that they're full of, like, their lungs are full of fluid or whatever. So there is another interpretation which I found, and that is this story in Live Science, which is a fairly reputable paper. Silent hypoxia may be killing COVID-19 patients. Okay. As doctors see more and more COVID-19 patients, they are noticing an odd trend. Patients whose blood oxygen saturation levels are exceedingly low, but who are hardly gasping for breath. So yes, that's a real thing that doctors are seeing. These patients are quite sick, but their disease does not present like typical acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is what ARDS means, a type of lung failure known from the 2003 outbreak of SARS coronavirus and other respiratory diseases. Their lungs are clearly not effectively oxygenating the blood, but these patients are alert and feeling relatively well, even as doctors debate whether to intubate them by placing a breathing tube down the throat. Okay. Now, I would like to go down and just like skip a couple of sections till we get to what the proposed solution is. At any rate, this is not a new phenomenon, said Dr. Mark Moss, the division head of pulmonary sciences and critical care medicine at the University of Colorado and Schutz's Medical campus. There are other conditions in which patients are extremely low on oxygen but don't feel any sense of suffocation or lack of air. However, the increased understanding of the people with COVID-19 may show up with these atypical coronavirus symptoms is changing the way doctors treat them. Normal blood oxygen levels are around 97%, and it becomes worrisome when the numbers drop below 90%. At levels below 90%, the brain may not get sufficient oxygen, and patients might start experiencing confusion, lethargy, or other mental disruptions. As levels drop into the low 80s or below, the danger of damage to vital organs rises. However, patients may not feel in as dire straits as they are. A lot of coronavirus patients show up at the hospital with oxygen saturations in the low 80s, but look fairly comfortable and alert. Okay. There are three major reasons people feel a sense of dyspnea or labored breathing. Something is obstructing the airway. That's not an issue. Another is when carbon dioxide builds up in the blood. A good example is during exercise, or increased metabolism means more carbon dioxide. The third phenomenon, particularly important, is decreased lung compliance. And here's where we get to the actual theory of what is happening. Lung compliance refers to the ease with which the lungs move in and out with each breath. In pneumonia and ARDS, fluids in the lungs fill microscopic air sacs called alveoli, where oxygen from the air diffuses into the blood. As the lungs fill with fluid, they become more taut and stiffer, and the person's chest and abdominal muscles must work harder to expand and contract the lungs in order to breathe. This happens in severe COVID-19 too, but in some patients, the fluid buildup is not enough to make the lungs particularly stiff. Their oxygen levels may be low for an unknown reason that doesn't involve fluid buildup. Okay. And then we come down here. There's a New York Times op-ed piece in which an author wrote, the lack of gas viewing might be due in particular to a particular phase of lung failure. When the lung failure first starts, the virus may attack the lung cells that make surfactant, a fatty substance in the alveoli, which reduces surface tension in the lungs, increasing their compliance. Without surfactant, the increased surface tension causes the alveoli to deflate, but if they are not filled with fluid, they won't feel stiff. This could explain how the alveoli fail to oxygenate the blood without the patient noticing the need to gasp for more air. So COVID-19 is tricking your lungs into not functioning, but your body doesn't realize they are not functioning, which is kind of what they were saying in the paper about T cells too. The virus may also create hypoxia by damaging the blood vessels that lead to the lungs. Normally, when a patient has pneumonia, the tiny blood vessels around the fluid-filled areas of lungs constrict. Sensing a lack of oxygen in the damaged areas, the body shunts blood to other healthier parts of the lungs. Because pneumonia fills the lungs with fluid, the person will feel starved for air and gasp for breath, but their vessels send the blood to the least damaged parts of the lungs, so their blood oxygenation stays relatively high despite the damage. In COVID-19, that balance may be off. The lungs aren't very fluid-filled and stiff, but the blood vessels don't constrict and reroute blood to the least damaged spots. People feel free to inhale and exhale without resistance, but the blood is still trying to pick up oxygen at alveoli that are damaged and inefficient. So here again, COVID-19 may be tricking the body into thinking it is fine. Now, I'd like to jump back to the Thailand medical news for another story. Breaking: the latest coronavirus research reveals that the virus has a mutated gene similar to HIV and is 1,000 times more potent. Okay. Now, this article was from February 29th, which is like an eternity ago in relation to this pandemic and the things we know about it. But I wanted to include it because I think it's still relevant to the overall focus of this broadcast, but also because it still seems to be relevant in understanding how serious COVID-19 can potentially be. So this story says, the latest research reveals that the virus has a mutated gene similar to HIV and is 1,000 times more potent than HIV. Now that should be like somewhat terrifying, right? Because HIV is a very scary disease and has been since the 1980s, but the reason that, and it is classified as a pandemic, it's a global pandemic, but the reason why it hasn't ever, at least not to the same extent, caused the chaos that COVID-19 has caused is simply because it's much harder to transmit. It's transmitted by bodily fluids and therefore requires active participants in specific activities for the most part to transmit it. Whereas COVID-19, once they found out it could be transmitted through the air by a cough, a sneeze, whatever, on surfaces, that, made it much more scary, especially if the two share similarities in the way that they infect people based on the glycoprotein envelope and this potentially this spike protein. So let me just read a little bit of this to give you an idea, and then I want to show you some articles that support this story, because I always hate to use just a story, even if it's, supposedly a fairly reputable publication like Thailand Medical. I mean, it seems to be reputable. But if there's no published pieces in scientific journals, I hesitate to use it. And even in the case of where it's a published paper in a non-peer-reviewed journal, I hate to use that. So in this case, there are both a paper in a non-peer-reviewed journal and a paper in a I think it's peer-reviewed, but if not, it's a much more reputable source. At any rate, the latest coronavirus research by a team of researchers from Nankai University in Tianjin, led by Professor Ruan Jisao, a prominent virologist and genomist, have discovered that the new SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that causes the COVID-19 disease has a mutated gene that is found in the HIV virus. That's in addition to the glycoprotein envelope, which is another thing that helps it to bind so that to your cells so that it can enter them, especially T cells, immune cells. And that's the other thing, that HIV attacks specific immune cells. And if COVID-19 can attack and take over those same cells, even though what they do once they attack and attach is different, the fact that they can both infect your immune system cells is pretty scary. So the first study, which was published that week in February on ChinaXIV.org, a platform used by the Chinese Academy of Sciences to release scientific research papers before they have been peer-reviewed. Okay, that's the first paper. These findings have huge implications on the potency of the coronavirus and also what it can cause in humans, not just the COVID-19 disease. Furthermore, the COVID-19 disease should never be compared to the common cold or influenza virus, as this new coronavirus is in a separate league of its own. And there is something that I think leadership really screwed up on, right? Because you talk to so many people today and you see them quoted in the media and they're just like, oh, it's no worse than a cold. Only old people get it. I'm not in any danger. I don't want to stay at home. I want to get a haircut, blah, 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 blah. And that's because in the very beginning, and it's somewhat excusable because nobody knew in the beginning. So when Trump and Pelosi and de Blasio, they were all like, no, go about your lives as normal. This is nothing to be worried about. It's just no worse than the flu, because that's what they were told. That's what they communicated to the public. That's what the public latched onto. And as time has gone by and not seemingly so many people have gotten sick that it hasn't affected a great deal of people personally, that's the definition that they went with. And that's unfortunate because when we research it like this, it seems like the truth is much more sobering than that belief. So you can have faith in that definition as much as you want to, but if it's not the truth, it's not going to save you. Okay, though it has not been peer-reviewed, 2 other studies, including one in Europe, have confirmed the findings. The combined findings from the 3 studies indicate that because of the HIV-like mutations, its ability to bind with human cells could be as much as 1,000 times more potent than the initial SARS virus of 2003. Okay, so SARS didn't really kill that many people. MERS, which was another relative, killed maybe a few more people, but it wasn't that much, but it also had an HIV gene sequence in it. So, but this one could be much more than that, and maybe it is. And this is what I'm trying to communicate because I've read all this, and it's something that obviously people aren't seeing, and so I think they need to be made aware. Okay. The findings also indicate that the SARS-CoV-2 has a dual attack approach to binding to human cells. The first is via the ACE2 receptors found on human cell membranes and is a typical mode of most coronaviruses. The new SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus has a plus 80% genomic matching to the previous SARS virus, hence it explains the property that it possesses. However, it must also be noted that the ACE2 protein does not occur in large quantities in healthy people, and this partially helped to limit the scale of the SARS outbreak, which infected close to 8,000 people globally. As the findings of the new study indicates, the new SARS coronavirus has a mutated gene similarly found on the HIV virus. It is also able to attack human cells via the target called furin, which is an enzyme that works as a protein activator in the human body. Typically, many proteins are inactive or dormant when they are produced and have to be cut at specific points to activate their various functions, which furin does in the human cellular pathways. Okay. And then we read down here, another research conducted also this month by Professor Li Hua, another prominent virologist and genetic scientist, and his team also confirmed those findings, and that's also in ChinaXIV.org, and I'll include links to all 3 of these papers plus this story down below. Now we come down here to a European study by French scientist Professor Dr. Etienne Decroix at the Marseille University in France. I can't speak French. Which was published in the scientific journal Antiviral Research, also found a furin-like cleavage site that is absent in similar coronaviruses, thus confirming the initial findings as well. Okay, and this is quoted here as being on the National Institutes of Health website, which is where I found it here, where it talks about the spike glycoprotein of the new coronavirus, and it contains a furin-like cleavage site. Okay, now also, HIV depends on the same process to infect cells. So here is another article, but this one is about how HIV uses the same process to infect cells. So I'm going to include that down below as well. And, it's not that I'm trying to scare people, it's just that I'm trying to present factual information based on science so that people can understand what this disease is about and what it can do. I should mention here, though, before I close out, is just that the study indicates that the HIV-like gene found on the new SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 coronavirus was not detected on any other coronavirus, including the MERS original SARS or even the bat coronavirus that was considered to be the original source of the new COVID-19 coronavirus, with 96% similarity in genes, which is, something that made researchers note that perhaps it was not a naturally occurring virus. But for the purposes of this report, that isn't really going to be considered because I don't think there's sufficient proof to classify it either way, although it's easier just to say it's natural. But the next thing that I want to talk about is the cytokine storm, and I think I'm saying that right. If I'm not, I apologize, but that's the way it looks like it should be pronounced to me. Yay, phonics. Anyway, the cytokine storm is, according to the NCBI website, let's see here. Whoop. There we go. The cytokine storm has captured the attention of the public and the scientific community alike, and while the general notion of an excessive or uncontrolled release of pro-inflammatory cytokines is well known, the concept of a cytokine storm and the biological consequences of cytokine overproduction are not clearly defined. Now note that this is from March 2012. So the cytokine storm has been known for a long time, and I think one of the other articles that I reference here is from 2008. So it is something, it's an effect that's been known for a long time, and how it affects the body. But at the time of this, they didn't understand it really well. Here's an interesting graphic they used, imagery of a cytokine storm. The first published article was in 1993 on graft versus host disease, and it's been associated with a lot of different diseases such as Epstein virus, streptococcus, influenza, variola, and severe acute respiratory system, as well as HIV. HIV is also, as I will show you in a couple of papers here, known for being something that, where the cytokine storm takes place. And basically it just overwhelms your system and causes major organ failure and death, potentially. Not always, but potentially. And then here is an article from later, I believe 2016. Don't quote me on that. But anyway, I'm not seeing it. I'm looking at it here. But anyway, it's COVID-19 cytokine storm, the interplay between inflammation and coagulation. Yeah, so that's, okay, from 2020. I'm sorry, published April 27, 2020. So this is an article about COVID-19 and the cytokine storm. Coronavirus disease has spread rapidly throughout the globe. It's associated with significant mortality, particularly in at-risk groups with poor prognostic features at hospital admission. The spectrum of disease is broad, but among hospitalized patients with COVID-19, pneumonia, sepsis, respiratory failure, and acute respiratory distress syndrome are frequently encountered complications. The pathophysiology of severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2 included ARDS has similarities to that of severe community-acquired pneumonia caused by viruses or bacteria. The overproduction of early response pro-inflammatory cytokines results in what has been described as a cytokine storm, leading to an increased risk of vascular hyperpermeability, that's heart, multi-organ failure, and eventually death when the high cytokine concentrations are unabated over time. Therefore, therapeutic strategies under investigation are targeting the overactive cytokine response with anti-cytokine therapies or immunomodulators, but this must be balanced with maintaining an adequate inflammatory response for pathogen clearance. Now that's important too, because while they understand, and the Lancet, which is where this appeared, is, one of the more respected medical publications. So I think that the COVID-19 cytokine storm connection is obviously there at this point. We don't have to debate that. And the effects of the cytokine storm are well known and have been around since, or have been studied since 1993. Okay, so it's not anything new. It's just new in relation to COVID-19. So so there are treatments that can be used to abate the effects of a cytokine storm, but what that last sentence is saying is you have to be careful how you treat it, because certain amounts of inflammation are important in order to fight the pathogen or the virus. If you just totally take away the inflammation, you're not fighting the virus anymore. So it's going to potentially cause more damage than it would otherwise. So that's cytokines and the cytokine storm. I hope I'm saying that right. Cytokine. I don't want to say it's cytokine. It might be cytokine now. Cytokine. Because I know if you're like in a medical profession, you're going to be annoyed with mispronunciation, and I'm sorry. But anyway, so jumping along here in this train of thought, let's go to pediatric hyperinflammatory syndrome and COVID-19. Children having heart attacks. We've seen this in the media, and I was talking to somebody on Facebook, or commenting on a Facebook post, and I mentioned this effect, and immediately people were like responding with, "That's not proven. That's not proven. No, no." And it's like, well, yeah, it seems to be pretty indicated, at least, that this is happening. It's obviously happening, but the question as to why it's happening might not be proven, which is like splitting hairs. But it just made me realize how people who don't know that much about something will grasp onto whatever they want to believe, and that becomes their truth, and they will argue that truth whether or not it seems to be like it's the real truth or not. So that's just something, and I've seen that a lot, like with people who don't really know that much, and they haven't and I mentioned this earlier, I think, in the video, but they haven't really experienced anything personal in relation to COVID-19. They're the people that are like, we want a haircut, we want to go back to blah 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 blah, without understanding the potential severity of what the COVID-19 infection can be. But anyway, so back to, and this is in the American College of Cardiology, which is a respectable publication, published May 15th, 2020. It's a look at, again, pediatric hyperinflammatory syndrome and COVID-19 statement and recommendations from a pediatric intensive care international collaborative conference call. So these are specialists in pediatric cardiology who are on an international conference call discussing this effect. And I don't know, where you could find a better qualified group of people to be talking about something that they're observing. So, a panel of internationally recognized experts in pediatric intensive care, pediatric cardiology, pediatric rheumatology, pediatric infectious disease, and Kawasaki disease, which is, I have a reference to a paper on Kawasaki disease too. The effects are similar, or potentially COVID-19 reducing the effectiveness of your immune system could open the door to Kawasaki syndrome. Okay. along with more than 1,800 viewers, including pediatric clinicians and researchers, as well as representatives from the World Health Organization, National Institutes of Health, Centers for Disease and Prevention, and European Commission, met on a 70-minute webinar of the Pediatric Intensive Care COVID-19 International Collaborative hosted by Boston's Children's Hospital on May 2nd. The panel concluded the following. So, there's your credentials, and here are the conclusions. Up to this point in the pandemic, COVID-19 infection leading to critical illness in children remains very infrequent. Most children are asymptomatic. They can transmit it if they have the virus. That's, being asymptomatic. You have the virus, you can transmit the virus, but you don't have symptoms, or they exhibit only mild symptoms. In the past 2 months, first in Europe and more recently principally in cities along the east coast of the U.S., with some now also reported in the Midwest and South, a small number of children have developed a more serious inflammatory syndrome in temporal association with COVID-19 in the community, often leading to the hospitalization and occasionally requiring intensive care. Okay, so kids with COVID-19 are developing this more serious inflammatory syndrome, which I've seen described as heart attacks in at least one case. In order to promote immediate awareness and begin worldwide research collaboration on this disorder, we recommend that clinicians caring for children throughout the world, including pediatricians and experts in pediatric intensive care, cardiology, infectious disease, immunology, rheumatology, adopt the case definition put forth by the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. See the sidebar. And here it is. 1. A child presenting with persistent fever, inflammation, and evidence of single or multi-organ dysfunction, shock, cardiac, respiratory, renal, gastrointestinal, or neurological disorder with additional features. This may include children fulfilling full or partial criteria for Kawasaki disease. Exclusion of any other microbial cause where you can't find another cause, including bacterial sepsis, staphylococcal or streptococcal shock syndromes, infections associated with myocarditis, such as enterovirus, waiting for results. I'm sorry that I butcher some of these words so bad. And 3, SARS-CoV-2 PCR testing may be positive or negative. So they're not saying you definitely need a positive COVID-19 test, but you should test, and if it's positive, then that will probably indicate that that's a part of it. So, yes, it's still fairly early on, but this is probably something that is going to be shown to be an effect of COVID-19, which can affect some children, and how that evolves in the future is unknown. But it's also a cytokine storm effect. And I will, of course, include this link, a link to this article too, if you want to pursue it. It just goes really in depth, and this video has gone, or this podcast has gone way too, depending on how you're receiving it. It's available as a podcast and a video. It's gone on long enough already. So now the next thing to look at in relation to this is other effects of the cytokine storm on people not normally as adversely affected by COVID-19. And here's a paper on the Kawasaki disease outbreak from the News and Medical Life Sciences, newsmedical.net site, which gives another explanation and some additional papers, which I haven't actually drawn links to. Now, we move on to the next thing that is presenting itself in this realm, and that is the death of younger COVID-19 patients related to blood clotting. And this is most usually cited as people in the 30 to 40-year-old range who are having strokes, like old people, strokes, due to blood clotting. They get blood clots, the blood clot goes to their brain, cuts off the blood supply, they have a stroke. And this is published April 28th, 2020 on Biospace. Early on in the COVID-19 pandemic, it appeared that the primary risk of death from the disease was severe pneumonia followed by a cytokine storm. As more is discovered about the disease caused by the SARS-CoV-2, an unexpected cause of death has been identified: heart attacks and strokes caused by these blood clots. Okay, so in this case, there's not much dispute that COVID-19 is the underlying factor responsible for heart attacks and blood clots. Heart attacks even in children, apparently, as we've just discussed, and blood clots causing heart attacks and strokes in older people, who are, the 30 to 40-year-old range, not older people, but older than children. And this in particular appears to be the cause of death in some younger patients under the age of 50. In a letter published tomorrow in the New England Journal of Medicine, investigators from New York City's Mount Sinai described 5 COVID-19 patients, all under the age of 50, who had large vessel strokes over a 2-week period. Of the 5, 1 died, 1 is still hospitalized, 2 are in rehabilitation, and 1 was discharged and sent home. All 5 patients had mild or no symptoms of COVID-19. So again, asymptomatic or slightly symptomatic people can have these big negative outcomes, which can, essentially kill you or change your life forever. I mean, if anybody's seen stroke victims, rehabilitation can involve years of work, and then maybe only have limited effectiveness in old people. So, I mean, that's there as part of having a stroke. Thomas Oxley, who led the study, is with the Department of Neurosurgery at Mount Sinai Health System. He said, "We're learning that this can disproportionately affect large vessels more than small vessels in terms of presentation of stroke. It is possible that inflammation in the blood vessel walls are triggering the blood clots, which is from COVID-19. It is also possible that it is directly caused by the virus." A study out of the Netherlands published in Thrombosis Research also described increased rates of thrombotic complications in 184 critically ill COVID-19 patients with pneumonia, citing a 31% rate of thrombotic complications. The risk including pulmonary embolism, deep venous thrombosis, ischemic stroke, heart attack, myocardial infarction, or systemic arterial embolism. So, yeah, and that's for younger people a serious risk. And again, it's not everybody, and apparently they're not sure, who is more at risk, but something definitely to keep in mind. So, and here's another article which I will also link. Blood clotting is a significant cause of death in patients with COVID-19. That's from April 30th. And then just to reference it out, inflammatory cytokines in acute ischemic stroke. This is from 2008. So it's not like, this is new in itself. It's new in relation to COVID-19. That's all. So, this is especially for the people who say, oh, it's unproven. Maybe the exact link between COVID-19 and the mechanism by which COVID-19 causes it is unproven. But the fact that, we have this result in this patient and we need to know why it happened, and COVID-19 is here and it's affecting them in this way, so now we have that much. Is it going to be connected? It seems like it probably will, but if you can say it's not proven at this time, I wouldn't make any life-altering decisions based on that assumption, in other words. Okay, and here we see the cytokine storm syndrome as a manifestation of primary HIV infection. So again, this is not a direct HIV COVID-19 link that proves they're somehow the same thing, because they aren't the same thing. They're very different, except for, as this article has pointed out, that one relationship with the glycoprotein envelope and the spike protein that allows them to break into T cells. Okay, however, it is just another way, if you respect HIV, then you should also respect COVID-19, because they share a lot of things in common, even though they're different organisms. Because now the abstract is HIV infection triggers an inflammatory response that manifests as acute retroviral syndrome, ARS, in most individuals infected with HIV. While this syndrome is usually self-limited, primarily HIV infection sometimes triggers a fulminant inflammatory process consistent with cytokine storm syndrome. Many of the key findings of cytokine storm syndrome include fever, splenomegaly, and cytopenia. Okay, never mind. I'm not going to do those words. Are routinely observed in ARS, suggesting CSS may be unrecognized in the setting of acute HIV infection. So, cytokine storm, COVID-19, many other illnesses, and HIV, another similarity between the two, which makes COVID-19 potentially much more dangerous than the common cold or the flu, which, again, is the definition that so many people seem to have gotten stuck on because of what was said by officials early on in the pandemic. And then here's another article. Plasma cytokine levels during acute HIV-1 infection predict HIV disease progression. Okay, and that's interesting because, the cytokine storm and the cytokine levels can predict the HIV-1 future with that individual. So that's pretty scary. And finally, arterial asymmetric stroke in HIV. So stroke is also an effect of HIV, which is this, pretty much the same as what's being observed in COVID-19. So there are so many parallels between what COVID-19 can do in patients and what HIV can do in patients that, if you look at it from this perspective, it really drives home why the government would do the lockdown, why there would be so many ongoing things, like contact tracing and things like that. It's not because it's a disease that is as harmless, technically harmless, although people die from the flu, obviously. I've had the flu more than once, and I felt like I was going to die, but I didn't. So, not that the flu is that tame, but COVID-19 is worse than the flu, obviously. And I wish people could understand that and maybe be more understanding of why all these things have been put in place for the safety of everyone. And, but yet it's not, it's the responsibility of the government to say that. You can't just magically expect people to understand that, especially if the media is not really explaining it to them like I am trying to do right here. The people who watch this video hopefully will come away with a new respect for COVID-19 and armed with, hopefully, a lot more facts than they had coming in. The next thing that I'd like to look at before I head into essentially the closing, although there may be one or two small areas I want to look at yet, is simply the question that I haven't really seen in the media yet, but that being, is anyone immune to COVID-19? And, that's certainly something that should come to mind. Like, is this something that 100% of people can get, even if they remain asymptomatic and, don't actually get sick? Does everybody get it? Or are some people essentially immune to it, both contracting it and carrying it? Or can they carry it without contracting it? Or, these are things which are important to know. For most people, and what would be the criteria for being immune. And one of the things that made me think about this was the fact that there have been a lot of stories coming up that there is certain racial divides in the rate of infection and death from COVID-19. And here, I'm going to switch over to the web. Okay, the coronavirus outsized toll on people of color. U.S. scientists say that better data, testing, and hospital preparedness are key to erasing inequalities and to defeating the pandemic overall. Okay. As figures emerge about the disproportionate toll that COVID-19 is taking on people of color in the United States, scientists are suggesting measures to help mitigate the inequalities. They say that better data is needed on the incidence of the disease, that testing needs to be ramped up, and that hospitals serving people at risk need to better prepare. Researchers and some U.S. lawmakers are now calling for a national commission devoted to identifying racial disparities in health that would act as a unified voice in trying to overcome them. So, essentially, more people of color are getting sick and dying from COVID-19. And a lot of the reasons that they're attributing this to are just simply the differences in the quality of healthcare available and the fact that there is a larger percentage of the crucial employees who kept working throughout the pandemic who are made up of people of color, whether, black, Hispanic, whatever. But just, now that's not true everywhere, obviously, because where I live in central Pennsylvania, there is not that same percentage of whites to people of color, so that pretty much everywhere you go, if you're looking at those service jobs that are being done through the pandemic, there's more white people doing them than people of color. So here, if that's the case, that wouldn't apply. But this also made me wonder about immunity, because I remembered because first off, to set this up, okay, HIV, as we've seen, HIV and COVID-19 can attack T cells using the glycoprotein spike and glycoprotein envelope to connect. And so they have an identical method of infecting T cells, and if they infect your T cells and turn them off, then that would be a reason why you could be dying from any number of things. So, okay, we have that similarity. And I also remembered reading that there were people who are immune to HIV. And I had to look it up again just to make sure what I remembered was true. But this paper from September 26, 1996. Scientists confirm natural resistance to HIV. Last month, AIDS researchers received some good news when two teams of scientists reported that people born with changes in both copies of a gene called CKR5 seem to have a natural resistance to HIV-1 infection. Now, taking this landmark finding one step further, another team of researchers confirms in this week's issue of Science that people who inherit two altered copies of the CKR5 gene avoid HIV infection even after being exposed to the virus many times. The scientists found that the 17 people in the study exposed to HIV-1 who had dual mutations in CKR5 were free of HIV infection, strongly suggesting they have a natural resistance to the virus. In addition, the scientists report that people who have one normal and one altered copy of CKR5 do become HIV positive, but they tend to progress slowly to full-blown AIDS and often live longer than most people infected with the virus. Okay, that seems to be really great. Then we move on to the next paper, which is biologists discover why 10% of Europeans are safe from HIV infection. So, 10% of white people with an origin in certain parts of Europe are immune to HIV. That's been known, and this was published April 3rd, 2005. Biologists at the University of Liverpool have discovered how the plagues of the Middle Ages have made around 10% of Europeans resistant to HIV. Scientists have known for some time that these individuals carry a genetic mutation of the CCR5 gene, delta 32 location, which we just saw in the last story, is the gene that determines that you're immune to HIV. And because HIV and COVID-19 use the same process to infect T cells, then it just follows that the same people who are genetically immune to HIV would be potentially genetically immune to COVID-19, at least that part of COVID-19 that affects the T cells. And that would be limited to apparently 10% of Europeans whose ancestors were exposed to one plague or another in Europe. They've also been puzzled by the fact that HIV emerged only recently and could not have played a role in raising the frequency of the mutation to the high levels found in some Europeans today. So, the professors at the University School of Biological Sciences decided that protection is due to another viral deadly disease acting over a sustained period in bygone historic times. And so maybe that is why also, in addition to the reasons listed, that people of color have a higher incidence of contracting COVID-19 than white people. Okay, now it's time for me to start closing this down. I know it's been a really, really long podcast / video, but I think I had to string all of the things together that I have strung together in order to give you a really good overview of what COVID-19 is, what it can do, and I think using the HIV comparison made it a lot easier for people to understand the points that I'm making, the points that are made by the material in this video that I reference. Again, it's not that there is any great correlation between the two, except that there may be, a correlation in how they can fuse to cells and enter certain cells. But other than that, there are two different kinds of viruses. So, because I know that's the first thing. Oh, you're saying that HIV is like COVID-19. You're saying it's the same thing. No, not at all. I'm just saying there are certain similarities that make it easier to understand and perhaps project what could happen with COVID-19 in the future, because we haven't been able to measure its effect over a long term because it's a new virus that's only just emerged several months ago. So, at the same stage with HIV, we weren't able to say, oh, in 10 years, this is going to be what happens with HIV because it was new at the time. Anyway, well, okay, let's first look at the mutation rate, just because it's something that I've seen used. This graphic I've seen used so much, and it's fun. It's a good graphic, and here, check it out. Okay, let's see. Oh, nope, this one. Up. There we go. Okay, so this is the genomic epidemiology of novel coronavirus. This is a global sampling. And notice, we have 4,481 of 4,481 genomes that have happened since COVID-19 was first sampled back here in 12/9/2019. There have been 4,481 genome variations / mutations between December 2019 and May 2020, right? And every mutation can be something brand new as far as effects. Mostly they're not. Mostly, it's not a harmful mutation, but it could be. And the more often it mutates, the more likelihood is, the higher the likelihood that it could latch onto or luck onto a mutation which is more favorable to the survival of the virus and less favorable to the survival of the host. Now, in comparison, because I've been using HIV as the virus of comparison, let's look at the mutation of this particular variation of HIV, the CRF01 strain of HIV, between January 1990 and January 2016. There have been 358 mutations. Okay. All over the world. And again, you can see they're spread all over the world. This particular variation also originated in China and Myanmar and spread out. And COVID-19, of course, did, as far as we know, originate in China and spread to the rest of the world, although right now the U.S. is the hub of everything. And you see, it has apparently mutated a lot more than AIDS did in a much longer period of time. So could that make it more dangerous? Yeah, I'm sure it could. But I'm not going into anything specific on that right now, because what I would like to look at is the future. And first, treatment, and then the future, because it ties in. Because if you can't treat it, you don't have much of a future. But if you can treat it, that's awesome. And so this, and again, there is a parallel. So I want to look at mostly the parallel. Hydrochloroquine is an antiviral, which can be used against a lot of different viruses and some bacteria and parasites like malaria. But apparently it's had some of its positive uses in the past against other viruses. So that's why they have been experimenting with using it against coronavirus, COVID-19. But I don't really want to bother looking at that, because I've looked at that before. And because it's been such a media thing with it, is just the anti-Trump media has so latched onto that treatment that it's just a pain. Okay, so this is from the Body Pro. And editor's note, on April 29th, early results from 2 noteworthy studies on remdesivir were released, because remdesivir is an is a drug that is an HIV drug that is being touted as a potential treatment for COVID-19. So you see, again, you have this, interlocked similarity of certain things within HIV and COVID-19, which you have to pay attention to understand it. So anyway, one small study from China showed remdesivir, I apologize if I'm not saying it right, had no benefit for people with COVID-19. Findings from a larger study conducted by the NIH, National Institutes of Health, showed remdesivir reduced recovery time by 4 days and lowered mortality rates in people with COVID-19. And it's already a drug that is used for HIV. Amid the current coronavirus crisis, HIV antiretrovirals have been getting far more mainstream attention than they usually do. First, it was thought that the long-time and outdated HIV medication lopinavir Caltera might have some activity against COVID-19, which is actually the name of the illness, with SARS-CoV-2 being the actual name of the virus, much as HIV is the name of the virus and AIDS is now HIV disease, the name of the illness. But then lopinavir failed against COVID-19 in a decent-sized study in China. While there are still other trials planned to investigate this medication, many lost hope in its promise after news of the study broke. Now everyone is waiting on several studies to see if investigational HIV drug remdesivir, in the same broad family as a handful of long-time HIV drugs, including Epivir, Emtrivia, has activity against COVID-19. A few years ago, the agent killed SARS and MERS, two similar coronaviruses in lab dishes. We may see those results in early April. So there is the chance that specifically HIV drugs can be used against COVID-19. A demand for remdesivir has spiked so high, especially after President Trump name-checked it as a promising agent at a March 19th press conference, that the drug's developer Gilead has pulled back from offering it prior to its U.S. Food and Drug Administration approval under the urgent needed caveat called compassionate use. It all raises questions of why we think HIV drugs would work against COVID-19, or more broadly, why we think drugs that work against one virus will work against the other. One part of the answer is that there's a precedent. It has been known for years that the very similar antiretrovirals 3TC and FTC also work against hepatitis B. FTC is a component of two fixed-dose combination drugs sold under the brand names Truvada and Descovy that are used for HIV pre-exposure prophylaxis. Even though HIV and Hep B are very different-looking viruses, 3TC and FTC disable the self-replication process that both viruses undertake once in the body. So that's an important point, because that's how these particular HIV drugs work. They keep the virus from self-replicating. Okay, that's one class of HIV viruses. There are so many other factors, such as what kinds of human cells viruses live inside us, what kind of host and viral proteins they require to replicate, etc., 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 that it may not work from one virus to another. Now, there is another way, which is the primary thing that I've been looking at in this report, in the way that viruses, which is the way that the viruses bind to the cells. So you have another class of HIV drug called fusion inhibitors, which affect the virus's ability to fuse onto its potential host cell. And so then the next question in my mind was, do fusion blockers work? Because that just, helps you to understand that the same fusion with the glycoprotein envelope or glycoprotein spike would indeed be, pretty much the same between the two. And here's just how a fusion inhibitor works. Antiretroviral HIV drug class. A fusion inhibitor blocks the HIV envelope from merging with the host CD4 cell membrane, fusion. This prevents HIV from entering the cell. Okay. Now, are there any HIV fusion inhibitors that are seen to work against coronavirus? Well, the anti-HIV drug nelfinavir, Viracept, is a potent inhibitor of cell fusion caused by the SARS-CoV-2 spike S glycoprotein, warranting further evaluation as an antiviral against COVID-19 infections. Severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus is the causative agent of the coronavirus disease, of course. A systematic screening of several drugs, including cardiac glycosides and kinase inhibitors and inhibitors of human immunodeficiency to virus HIV entry, revealed that only the FDA-approved HIV protease inhibitor Viracept drastically inhibited SNSO-mediated cell fusion with a complete inhibition at... Okay, so here is indeed an anti-HIV drug, which is a potent inhibitor of cell fusion caused by the glycoprotein spike, which seems to be shared between COVID-19 and HIV. So yes, HIV drugs can work both the anti-replication type of drug and the anti-fusion type of drug can potentially work against COVID-19, which, reinforces the similarity of the way that the two viruses attack cells or enter cells or replicate, which I'm sure most viruses replicate the same way. So that's not, as much of a similarity as the fact that they share a protein envelope, protein spike, which enables them to fuse to cells and enter the cells. Okay, so those are important things to remember. Now, after that, we have to look to the future and say, what is the future of this? Once you recover from COVID-19, are you not recovered? Because in HIV, that's not the case. With HIV, there are 3 stages of infection. And with COVID-19, we are now seeing what would be analogous to stage 1 HIV infection, which is acute HIV infection, which is right here. Within 2 to 4 weeks after infection with HIV, people may experience a flu-like illness, which may last a few weeks. This is the body's natural response to infection. When people have acute HIV infection, they have a large amount of virus in their blood and are very contagious. But people with acute infection are often unaware that they're infected because they may not feel sick right away or not at all. Again, the asymptomatic people, these are just, stages of a viral infection, potentially with HIV being a viral infection that you just don't get rid of. Okay, to know whether someone has an acute infection, either a 4th generation or nucleic acid test is necessary, which is why they were having such a hard time doing a test for COVID-19, because they had to find the right proteins or whatever to test for in order to see if the virus was present. It's not just like you say, oh, look, there's the virus wiggling around on this slide. So, it's not that easy. And the difference also, with HIV is that you may think you've been exposed through sex or drug use and you have flu-like symptoms. You should seek medical attention because that's a good sign. And it's not always the case, because you could just have the flu. But okay, so COVID-19 is somebody you could have coughed or sneezed on you, or you were jogging behind them and their cloud of fumes contained COVID-19 and you're infected that way. So there's different routes to infection, but stage 1 seems similar, because stage 1 HIV infection sounds very much like the COVID-19 that we're familiar with. And perhaps it is more lethal in this stage because it kills a lot more people than acute HIV infection does, although fewer people are actually infected with HIV than are infected with COVID-19 because of the different routes to infection. Okay. Stage 2 of HIV is clinical latency. This period is sometimes called asymptomatic HIV infection or chronic HIV infection. So this is after you're over your initial acute HIV infection phase, you enter the second phase where you're asymptomatic. You just are a carrier. You have it, but you don't know you have it. It's not really hurting you. You feel okay. Now, if this stage is mirrored with COVID-19, it's an indication, I think, which I may not, be in sync with actual medical professionals because I'm not one, but I think it's worth thinking about that there could be a stage 3, or there could be a long-term communicability with COVID-19 if indeed you get through the initial acute COVID-19 infection phase, you seem to beat it, and yet you still carry it. So, stage 2, clinical latency, HIV inactivity or dormancy. Once again, this period is sometimes called asymptomatic HIV infection or chronic HIV infection. During this phase, HIV is still active but reproduces at very low levels. People may not have any symptoms or get sick during this time. For people who aren't taking medicine to treat HIV, this period can last a decade or longer. So is this indicating that if you have COVID-19 and you survive the initial phase, that you may have to take some kind of drug similar to the antiretroviral cocktails that HIV positive people take in order to postponed the eventual onset of full-blown AIDS? I don't know. I don't think anybody knows that yet. It hasn't been the case in the past with diseases like SARS and MERS, but this isn't those two viruses, but it isn't HIV either. So I think that's kind of a gray area at this point, and people aren't even really talking about it because for the most part, we're still in the acute HIV infection stage of the pandemic, although obviously some people have progressed beyond that infection stage, especially the people that never actually developed full-blown COVID-19 but tested positive for it, the asymptomatic people that just never got it, which could be immune, or the immune people could just not even be positive at all. So there's some question there too, I think. Okay. And then people who are taking ART the right way every day may be in this stage for several decades. It is important to remember that you can still transmit HIV to others during this phase. So while you are in the post-active acute infection phase and in the asymptomatic phase, you can still transmit HIV. So can you still transmit COVID-19? That's the question. If you indeed, after having COVID-19, are again positive for the disease. And that is not impossible. And then eventually you develop full-blown AIDS if you have HIV, but that may not be the case. So the question then becomes, is it possible after you recover from the acute infection of COVID-19 and even after you test free of the virus? That's the important thing. Now, there are cases where Ebola survivors have tested as being clear of Ebola and then weeks later find, or whatever sense of time it is, later having it found that they are still actually infected with it, but the virus is in essence hiding. So here's a couple of articles in the popular media about one such case where an American doctor returned from fighting Ebola and recovered from Ebola himself, and yet it's lurking in his eye. And they said, the doctors say that treating it in his eyes could actually cause it to come back and he could become infectious again. So they're, not sure. It's always going to just live there hiding in his eyes, or is it going to turn back on someday and become infectious? They don't know. But Ebola and COVID-19 and HIV are very different viruses. So this may not ever actually happen, but it's just one more thing that would have to be considered as a possibility. So now back to COVID-19 and back to Thailand medical news. So this is from March 31st. So it's been known for a while. Breaking news. Study shows more than 50% of clinically recovered COVID-19 patients are still infectious with the SARS-CoV-2 virus. So back we go. People who have passed the acute COVID-19 infection stage are now in a stage 2 clinical latency where they show no symptoms but are still infectious. Yes, so that way too, it seems that COVID-19 is acting in the same way that HIV does. A new study published in the American Thoracic Society's American Journal of Respiratory and Critical Care Medicine gives a warning that the majority of patients who are clinically recovered were still found to be infectious with the SARS-CoV-2 coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And I mentioned the SARS, or not SARS, but the Ebola hiding thing because I've seen also reports that people test as being free of COVID-19, especially in Asia, and then several weeks later they're tested again and they're tested positive again, even though they're still showing no symptoms. So either they were reinfected or the virus was at such low levels that it was in effect hiding and then started coming back. So this is scary. Like, what happens then? Does it once again progress into the acute stage, or does it just stay at that stage and you are essentially infectious for decades, weeks, months? how much like the HIV stage 2 is it? The medical researchers found that half of the patients they treated for mild COVID-19 infection still had coronavirus for up to 8 days. The new research was published, and they were treated and released, and then they were tested again. Okay, and the median age of those people was 35.5 years. Okay, so again, and all these will be, in the description below, so you can go and read this. So it does come back. Now, knowing this, that you still have it after you beat it, or a majority of people do, then if we move on to this bill that's up in front of Congress now, the infamous H.R. 6666, COVID-19 testing, reaching, and contacting everyone, Trace Act, which a lot of the conspiracy people have been like, oh my God, it's the end of the world, it's the mark of the beast, blah, 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 blah. Okay. 6666 is really an unfortunate number to use, but whatever. It's probably the next number in sequence to use for a bill, so it was used, and whatever. But anyway, contact tracing is mostly, what people are in the mainstream seem to be having a problem with, because that involves actually tracing everybody via some method. They suggest an app on your smartphone that will report everywhere you go, all the people around you, so that they can see who you come in contact with who may be infected with COVID-19, had been infected with COVID-19, or if you are or have been infected with COVID-19, who all you come in contact with. And then they can correlate this data with the people that actually test positive for COVID-19 or come down with the acute stage of COVID-19 and track the pandemic. But of course, that involves tracking everything you do and everywhere you go, and so people understandably have issues with that. But as we see, we're not sure how long COVID-19 infection can last, how long communicability can last, and this is the stage that they're now at, trying to figure the disease out. And a lot of this is only going to be answered over time, and how much time depends on how many people become COVID-free and remain that way. So that also explains why the Pentagon would say that somebody who was hospitalized with coronavirus, which apparently they're making a distinction between just being infected by it and being either asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, with someone who's actually been hospitalized because of the disease. And they're saying right now that that permanently disqualifies you from military service. And, that's, I guess they're figuring because people who are actually hospitalized have maybe more of a chance of carrying it after recovery, or may have more of a chance of having lasting lung damage, heart damage, whatever, because of the cytokine storm, or, I'm not sure exactly what their logic is, but I'll include a link to this story. And that brings me to the end of this report. I hope I have provided you with a reasonably factual basis for understanding the COVID-19 threat, why it is more a threat than most people seem to think it is, why the ongoing testing and monitoring of people to understand where the disease is going to go is important, and why the government has created the lockdown and kept it going for as long as it did, and whether that is potentially due to fragmented mismanagement at the part of the federal government or the states. That remains to be debated. But for the time being, it just seems to me that COVID-19 is a lot more scary as far as a organism than what the popular media explains it as, or than what the public understands it as. And hopefully this video / podcast will allow you to have a better understanding and to come to your own conclusions based on that understanding. Until next time, thanks for watching or listening. See you later. Bye.